September 14th, 2005. Huntsville, Texas. The sun is dropping behind the razor wire, turning the red brick of the walls unit the color of dried blood. Inside, at precisely 6:17 p.m., a steel door yawns open and a small convoy of quiet men in green carry out the final ritual the state of Texas knows by heart. Frances Newton is already strapped down. Leather crosses her wrists and ankles. Cotton tape pins the IV lines that snake toward the clear, deadly cocktail. She's 40 now, older than the photographs you've seen, her face thinned by years of fluorescent light and institutional food and the slow-motion grind of appeals. She has spent 17 years and change waiting for this room, this gurney, this minute that stops the clock. Third woman executed in Texas since the death penalty returned. The number sounds clinical. The story isn't. They read the case summary. Triple murder, husband, son, baby daughter. The words are familiar to everyone in the viewing booth, but today they feel like shrapnel. Adrian Newton, 23. Alton, 7. Farah, 22 months. People who should be home on a Wednesday night, not part of a sentence. There is a moment always when the person on the gurney stops being a headline and becomes a body again, breathing, blinking, deciding what the last words of a complicated life should be. Frances declines a final meal. She declines final word. She offers nothing. No confession, no plea, no apology. Silence as strategy or silence as verdict. Which one is it? Outside, the protests split along the seams we all know. Hand-painted signs for mercy. Posters for justice. A handful of reporters rehearse stand-ups about a case they did not witness in 1987. A case they know through transcripts and press packets and the steady cadence of "the state alleges." But this isn't a story that begins with a needle. It begins 18 years earlier in a southwest Houston apartment, where the night air carried the ordinary sounds of television laughter and a toddler's sleep and a young father putting off tomorrow's worries for one more hour. It begins with a plan made weeks before that, in an insurance office where ink dried on policies that would outlive the people they named. It begins with a woman who says she didn't do it, a shadowy Charlie who did, and a mother-in-law who answered the cameras with a line that cut through all the noise. There ain't no Charlie. She's Charlie. So how does a 21-year-old mother end up here? How does someone who shopped for diapers and formula also shop for life insurance policies on the people she was supposed to protect? The prosecution said it was simple. Motive means opportunity. Money on the table. A failing marriage. Access to a gun that wasn't hers. The defense said it was simpler. A drug debt, a dangerous man, a frame-up, a mother who made bad choices, but not these. 2 stories. 1 gurney. Which story survives the needle? Watch the choreography of a Texas execution, and you see how many hands it takes to end a life. 1 person checks vitals. 1 reads the order. 1 signals the unseen team on the other side of the glass to push the first plunger. The room narrows to a point, the face of the condemned. Some cry, some pray. Some rage. Some talk to the families of their victims as if time can be bent backward with a sentence. Frances does none of it. She gives the camera nothing to read, and yet the silence speaks. Is it defiance? Is it emptiness? Is it the last hold on a story she clung to for 17 years, that she did not pull the trigger, that a man named Charlie walked into that apartment and executed her family while she was powerless to stop it? The officials call out the time as if they can pin the moment to the wall. 6:17 p.m. pronounced, that's the official word. But the unofficial words are the ones that haunt. Insurance, signature, pistol, residue, motive. Words you'll hear in a courtroom, yes, but also words you hear when a plan slides into place. 3 weeks before the murders, a woman walks into an office and buys policies on her husband and her baby, names herself the beneficiary, and, according to the state, signs his name for him. 3 shots, 1 each, execution style. The gun disappears into a paper bag. The next morning, the claims begin. That's one version. In the other version, the gun is planted, the bag is panic, and the rest is a prosecutor's mosaic, glued together with assumptions. Which version matches the blood and metal and timelines? Which version lives once the appeals are over? Look again at the setting, Huntsville. the old red fortress where Texas keeps its most final promises. The building has seen more last breaths than any other address in the state. But every execution day is an opening scene if you decide to rewind the tape. On the other side of this gurney is April 7th, 1987, the Eldridge Parkway apartment, the stillness of television light on cheap walls, the small shoes by the couch, the crib with a blanket folded in a way that only mothers fold blankets. There is no forced entry, no ransacked drawers, no neighbor reports of a screaming match. Just 3 bodies and the clean line of a single bullet for each, as if someone believed speed and precision would erase the chaos of what came before and what would come after. This is not just about what the state proved. It's about what made people believe. The neighbor who saw a paper bag, the ballistics that matched a .25 caliber pistol tied to the boyfriend, the skirt with gunshot residue, the insurance paperwork stamped and filed before grief had a chance to learn the names on the death certificates. The jury didn't have to be poets. They just had to connect dots. But dots can be arranged a lot of ways. If a drug dealer named Charlie existed, why leave a murder weapon in the orbit of the accused? If he didn't exist, why did Francis keep saying his name as if speaking him enough times would conjure him into the record? Tonight, the answer isn't coming from the gurney. So the only way to know is to go back. Back to the marriage already cracked by separation. Back to the man she was dating, the drawer where a borrowed pistol waited, the first lie, the second lie, the third. Back to the office where ink dried, where a number, $50,000, looked bigger than the future it required to collect. Back to the moment someone decided the fastest way out was through the people in the way. The path to Huntsville is paved with choices, each one small enough to justify in the moment and large enough to ruin everything later. Why begin here, at the end? Because endings tell you what a story thinks of itself. This ending, no words, no meal, no plea, says the case doesn't need a flourish. It dares you to find the twist that 17 years of defense lawyers and television producers didn't. If there's a ghost in the room, it isn't Francis. It's the unanswered. Were those policies a financial seatbelt, like she hinted, or a countdown timer? Was the gun a coincidence of proximity, or the tool of a premeditated plan? How does a mother look at her children and see dollar signs? And if she didn't, who did? Here's the promise. We're not going to drown this in speculation or soft-focus tragedy. We're going to chart every mile marker, documents, witnesses, residue, timelines, and let the map take us where it takes us. If the route leads to greed sharpened into murder, you'll see it. If it leads to a myth named Charlie, you'll see why it survived as long as it did. We'll walk into the apartment minute by minute. We'll sit in the insurance office while the agent pushes forms across a desk. We'll open the drawer where the pistol slept and ask who knew, who touched, who lied. And when we return to Huntsville at the end of this journey, you'll know whether the silence at 6:17 p.m. was courage, calculation, or nothing at all, because there's one more truth about execution rooms. They close the book for the state, but they don't finish the story for the rest of us. To finish it, we have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning is 3 weeks before the murders, when ink met paper and a mother became a beneficiary. Ready to see how a signature can pull a trigger? Southwest Houston, Eldridge Parkway. Tuesday night air sits heavy and ordinary, the kind of night that doesn't warn you it's about to be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Inside a modest upstairs unit, the Newton apartment wears the usual signs of young family life. A cup with a cartoon on the rim drying by the sink, a tiny sneaker kicked under the coffee table, a folded blanket at the edge of a crib because mothers fold blankets even when they're too tired to fold anything else. The TV murmurs to itself. Streetlights draw pale bars across the carpet through blinds that never sit quite straight. If you pressed pause right here, it would look like 100 other apartments. But the thing about ordinary is how fast it breaks. The prosecutors would later call the murders execution style. That phrase has a way of sanitizing what it really means. It means close and deliberate and chosen. One shot per life, clean, controlled, practiced, or at least committed. It means someone walked in and decided there would be no argument, no struggle, no second chance. Adrian Newton, 23, likely half watching TV or half thinking about the next day's shift, A man in the limbo of an estranged marriage where you keep a key and a routine you don't trust anymore. 7-year-old Alton, tall enough to reach the freezer handle but still mixing up left shoes and right shoes, winding down in the gravitational pull of bedtime. Farah, 22 months, a toddler who sees the world from knee level and still believes every door opens to love. None of them knew that the night had already been chosen for them weeks earlier, when signatures planted a seed that would grow into gunfire. The weapon doesn't belong here. Not in a house with a crib and a cartoon cup, but it's here anyway, a small pistol, the kind that vanishes in a paper bag and doesn't ask for attention. The state will later trace its path like you trace a river on a map, cousin to boyfriend to girlfriend, with stops in a bedroom drawer and a life that wasn't supposed to intersect with this one. For now, all that matters is how a barrel erases distance. You can stand across a room and talk for 10 minutes and not know a person. You can stand within arm's reach with a gun and know everything you need to know in a second. There's a theory about the order of the shots. Prosecutors will organize the event because that's what prosecutors do. They stack facts until they look like a staircase. They say Adrian first because he's the only one who might fight, the only one who might turn an execution into a mess. Then Alton, because 7-year-olds run and scream and break your plan if you let them. Then Farah, because a baby can't help herself, and because leaving her would make the story wobble. And this story is all angles. They don't know for certain, but it fits the logic of people who want control. 3 bodies, 1 bullet each. No wild spray. No wasted noise. Just a sequence. The apartment doesn't fight back. No forced entry to explain. No ripped drawers to point at and say, robbery. No broken lock to circle in red ink for the jury. It's almost polite, the way the scene sits there waiting to be processed. That politeness will become part of the evidence. It will suggest familiarity, someone who didn't need to break in, someone who eased past the threshold as if the walls learned her footsteps a long time ago. Someone who could stand close enough to deliver 1 shot at a time without anyone taking a swing or making it to the door. Random violence is clumsy. This wasn't clumsy. People always ask about the noise. How did no one hear 3 gunshots? This is Houston, not a small town where a slammed car door turns heads. Apartments swallow sound when they want to. TVs cover gaps. Neighbors learn to fold their lives around other people's lives. Sometimes you hear everything and decide to hear nothing. Sometimes you hear nothing at all. What matters is what the detectives don't find. There's no sign the victims had the chance to make the kind of noise that saves you. After, the weapon can't stay. The same kind of planning that picks 1 bullet for each person picks a bag for the gun. Paper, ordinary, disposable. The kind of bag you could tuck into the crook of your arm without anyone asking questions. There will be a witness later, someone who remembers a bag being stashed, the nervous choreography of someone moving evidence from a home to a relative's house as if changing addresses can change provenance. That witness will become a hinge in the case. But right now, the bag is just a container for a problem no one has solved yet. Here is where grief and logistics cross wires. While normal families start with a phone call, followed by a collapse, followed by the mechanically awful tasks of picking funeral clothes and making lists of people to notify, the next morning turns toward paperwork of a different kind, insurance, signatures again, but this time on claim forms. Less than 24 hours after 3 single shots redraw a family tree as a stump, a beneficiary makes her way to an office. The timing is a fact, not an opinion, and facts like timing become loud in courtrooms. You can argue motive for weeks. You can't move a date stamp. Detectives arrive and do what detectives do. Measure, photograph, bag, label. They keep the distance they need to stay objective. But there's no way to inventory a crib without learning something about the moral weather of the room. They note the absence of things that are supposed to be present. No pry marks, no defensive wounds that say a fight started and lost, no ransacked mess that says strangers came for stuff. They note the presence of something that shouldn't be present. The surgical economy of 3 shots, each sufficient, each final. Crime scenes talk. Some whisper, some boast. This one recites. By the end of the first day, gravity starts to pull everything toward the same small cluster of details. The gun once it's traced, the witness who saw the bag, the insurance that leans forward and raises its hand before anyone has finished saying, "I'm sorry." The relationship map that shows the estranged husband in one circle and a boyfriend in another, with a dotted line connecting them through a drawer where a pistol slept. The air changes when a case discovers its own center of mass. You can feel it in the way questions get shorter. Who had the key? Who knew the gun? Who signed this? Who benefits? The defense narrative, when it arrives, will be a different kind of path through the same facts. A man named Charlie, a drug debt, a dangerous visit from someone with a reason to settle accounts, and a carelessness to leave a weapon nearby for someone else to discover and panic about. That version tries to draw chaos into a room that otherwise refuses to admit it. It has to explain why a killer would execute 3 people with precision and then abandon the tool of precision like a calling card. It has to explain why the earliest aggressive movement after the murders wasn't toward a casket, but toward a counter where benefits are calculated. It has to explain why close-range gunshots didn't draw a neighbor to the door, but did draw a beneficiary to an office before breakfast. Every story has to pay its own bills. We leave the bodies where the law requires them to be left until the photographs are done telling their part. We leave the casings to be counted. We leave the trajectories to be diagrammed on a board that will roll into a courtroom months later and stand next to a witness who points with a stick and says, "Here and here and here." What we don't leave behind is the rhythm of the evening. 3 lives in soft focus becoming 3 exhibits with hard edges. The apartment goes dark, but the paperwork doesn't. Evidence is a bureaucracy. It files itself. What makes this crime scene different from the thousands that have passed through Houston's homicide unit isn't gore. It's the way intent sits in the open. Whoever did this didn't decide to argue their way to a killing. They decided to eliminate obstacles. That's what 1 bullet per person says. Not rage, not panic, not chance. Removal. That word will matter when we get to motive. Removal has a twin called gain, and cases like this are built on how often those twins hold hands. We'll come back to the measurements and the lab reports. The residue that decides whether someone's clothes tell on them, the ballistics that pretend metal has a signature. For now, we've seen enough to ask the only question that matters at this stage: what kind of plan needs a scene this clean? If you know the answer, you already know where we're going next. 3 weeks before the shots, a desk, a pen, a policy number, and the quietest sound in the world: wet ink drying on paper that promises money if someone stops breathing. That's the beginning behind the beginning. 3 weeks before the murders, Francis Newton walked into an insurance office carrying nothing more dangerous than a pen. But that pen would become the first weapon in a chain of decisions that prosecutors later called premeditation. On the surface, it looked like paperwork, ordinary forms, routine signatures, the kind of documents young families sometimes buy for peace of mind. Scratch the surface, though, and what you see is a countdown. She bought 2 policies, $50,000 each. One for her husband, Adrian, one for her baby daughter, Farah, not for herself. Not for all 3 children, just Adrian and Farah, and she named herself the sole beneficiary. That detail hit investigators like a siren. Life insurance is meant to protect the people you leave behind, not to enrich the person planning ahead. For prosecutors, it was the very definition of motive typed out in black ink. The strangest part was how quickly she moved. 3 weeks, 21 days, barely enough time for premiums to clear before her family was dead. Investigators would later say the timing was too neat to be coincidence, as if the paperwork and the crime scene were pages in the same manual. Buy the policies, stage the murders, collect the money. The sequence was so tight it read like choreography. Adrian never signed those papers. He couldn't have because the signatures weren't his. Frances admitted later that she forged them, brushing it off as if it were some harmless shortcut. She said she wanted to surprise him, that she was thinking about family security, that she was just covering premiums and trying to plan for the future. But prosecutors saw something darker. a woman who knew her husband would never agree, and so she wrote his name for him. Forgery wasn't new to Frances. She had already been convicted once before. To the jury, that history made the ink look even more like intent. And why Farah, the baby, and not her son Alton? That question haunted the case. Some argued it showed Frances didn't plan to kill Alton, that she only wanted the policies on Adrian and Farah because they were cheaper, easier to justify. Others saw it as a miscalculation, a hole in the plan she couldn't patch once all three were dead. Whatever the explanation, the omission looked odd, and odd details stand out when you're deciding between life and death. By April 1987, Frances and Adrian's marriage was collapsing. They were estranged, living apart in everything but legal paperwork. Both had found other partners. Adrian was drifting in his own direction, while Frances was with a man named Jeffrey Freo. To the outside world, the Newtons were still married. But inside, they were fractured, and fractured marriages create pressure. Frances had bills stacking, children to raise, and no stable income. Adrian wasn't offering much financial support. For someone already caught forging signatures and stealing from employers, temptation didn't need to knock hard. The timing of the policies, the crumbling marriage, and the murders stacked together like dominoes. Buy policies in March, kill in April, file claims in April. From a distance, it looked calculated, like she had written her own script and was following it scene by scene. When investigators discovered that she had filed claims the very next morning, before funerals were even arranged, the suspicion hardened. To them, it wasn't grief driving her to paperwork. It was greed. This is where motive took center stage in court. Money is a reason everyone understands. You don't need psychology textbooks or obscure theories to convince a jury that $100,000 might tempt someone drowning in debt and desperation. Add in a history of forgery and theft, and the picture sharpened. Prosecutors framed it as escalation, from forging documents to stealing money to killing for a payout. A straight line of crime, with murder as the final upgrade. Defense attorneys pushed back, of course. They argued the policies were harmless. That lots of families buy insurance without meaning anything sinister. That Frances may have been careless with signatures, but not murderous with intent. They leaned on the Charlie narrative, suggesting that the real danger came from outside, from the shadowy drug dealer Adrian allegedly owed money to. They wanted the jury to believe the insurance was coincidence, nothing more. But coincidence is fragile in a courtroom. Every time the prosecution put a piece of paper on the stand, the forged forms, the policy numbers, the date stamps, that fragility cracked a little more. For the jury, the question wasn't whether Frances Newton loved her children at some point in her life. The question was whether $100,000 looked like a way out. And with the policies in evidence, her financial history in the record, and the timing painted across the calendar for everyone to see, the answer leaned heavily toward yes. Insurance, prosecutors argued, wasn't just background noise. It was the motive written in ink. And once you accept the motive, the rest of the case starts to fall into place. Access to the gun, the witness who saw the bag, the residue on her clothes, all of it is framed by the money waiting on the other side of 3 deaths. Without the policies, the story might wobble. With them, it locks into focus. This is why investigators kept circling back to that small office in March 1987. Not the crime scene in April, not the prison cell in 2005, but the desk, the pen, and the signatures that shouldn't have been there. Because if the murders were the climax, the policies were the prologue. They were the moment Frances Newton stopped thinking about life insurance and started thinking about life's price tag. And that's where the story shifts from paperwork to pattern. Because Frances's forgery wasn't new, her theft wasn't new. Her willingness to cross lines for money wasn't new. Which raises the next question. When someone shows you a pattern, how surprised should you be when they take it to its logical extreme? To understand why prosecutors believed Frances Newton capable of killing for money, you have to step back before the night of April 7, 1987. Murder, they argued, wasn't a sudden break in her character. It was the escalation of a pattern already in motion. Frances Elaine McLemore was born April 12, 1965. By her early 20s, instead of building a career or a future, she was already shaping a reputation in ink and deception. In December 1985, just 2 years before the murders, she was convicted of forgery. It wasn't a misunderstanding. She had deliberately falsified documents to gain money. The sentence was 3 years of probation, but the more important sentence was written in her record. Proof that she knew how to use a pen like a weapon. Proof that she was willing to cheat when money was the prize, and that wasn't her only brush with dishonesty. Around the same time, her employer caught her stealing cash. She didn't just cut corners, she pocketed money that didn't belong to her. Fired and exposed, she left with more than unemployment. She left with a reputation for theft that would follow her into the courtroom years later. To prosecutors, these weren't isolated mistakes. They were building blocks in a personality that saw rules as suggestions and money as the ultimate goal. By 1987, Frances's life looked divided. On one side, she was a mother of 2 with a husband, a family apartment, and the facade of stability. On the other side, she was a woman under pressure, already branded a forger and thief, scrambling for money and living a life that leaned on shortcuts. Adrian and Frances were estranged. Their marriage wasn't dead, but it was hollow, an empty title on paper. Both of them had stepped outside the marriage. Adrian was seeing other women. Frances was with a man named Jeffrey Freo. That relationship wasn't just emotional. It would become the link between her and the murder weapon. Jeffrey's cousin, Michael Moulton, had loaned him a small .25 caliber pistol months before. It sat in Jeffrey's apartment tucked away in a drawer. Ordinary enough, except Frances had keys. She was there often, doing laundry, living part-time, as if the apartment belonged to her too. She knew where Jeffrey kept his things, including the pistol. It wasn't her gun, but it might as well have been. When prosecutors later laid out the sequence of events, this access became the bridge. Jeffrey had the gun, Frances knew it, and the gun became the tool of a triple murder. Meanwhile, her financial situation kept tightening. With a forgery conviction on her record, legitimate jobs were harder to hold. She was raising 2 children, mostly on her own. Adrian wasn't providing much, and the separation meant their money never pooled the way married couples usually share. Desperation stacked on top of bad habits. She had already shown she would forge for cash. She had already shown she would steal from employers. Now she had a chance to convert her family into a payout through insurance. Prosecutors said it wasn't a leap. It was a staircase. Think about the escalation. Forgery in 1985, theft the same year, life insurance in 1987, each step bigger than the last. Each one more dangerous. When you plot it, the curve doesn't bend toward reform, it bends toward destruction. And when you put a person with that curve into a failing marriage, with access to a gun, and a fresh set of insurance policies waiting to pay out $100,000, you don't have to stretch far to see where the story ends. The defense argued that Frances was simply a woman in a broken marriage, trying to juggle 2 children and survive. They said her forgery conviction was behind her, that plenty of people have past mistakes without becoming killers. They wanted the jury to see her as overwhelmed, not calculated. But prosecutors countered with one hard fact. 3 weeks before the murders, she was still forging signatures. Not in 1985, in 1987. The past wasn't behind her, it was still happening, and while Frances played the role of wife and mother in public, her actions told another story. The life insurance, the secret relationship, the theft, the lies, they all fit the pattern. She was the common thread tying forgery, financial schemes, and now firearms together. The jury didn't have to invent a motive. It was written across her record. Patterns matter in court because they make crimes easier to believe. A stranger suddenly murdering her husband and children for no reason is hard to accept. But a woman with a history of deception, caught forging again, sitting on fresh insurance policies, and with access to the murder weapon? That's not hard to believe at all. So by the time prosecutors stood in front of the jury, they didn't paint Frances as a monster who snapped out of nowhere. They painted her as someone who had been walking toward this moment for years. A liar, a thief, and finally, when the chance for a $100,000 payout appeared, a killer. And that's what made the next step so damning. Because if the policies proved motive and the pattern proved character, the weapon would prove opportunity. And when detectives followed the trail of that pistol, the dots didn't just connect, they carved her name into the evidence. Follow the metal. In cases built on motive and opportunity, emotion is noisy. Steel is quiet. The .25 caliber pistol doesn't give speeches, it doesn't contradict itself, and it doesn't forget where it's been. Trace its route, and you get a map more honest than anyone's memory. Cousin to boyfriend, to drawer to girlfriend, to paper bag, to a relative's house. And finally to an evidence locker with a tag that might as well read, "This way to the truth. Start at the lending." Michael Moulton owns the pistol. He loans it to his cousin Jeffrey Frio, months before the murders. No conspiracy there. People borrow guns for protection all the time. Jeffrey keeps it in a bedroom chest of drawers. Same place you'd stash a watch you don't wear or a passport you only need every few years. Enter Frances. She has a key. She does laundry. She moves through that space like a second tenant. That means she knows the drawer. She knows the gun. You don't need cameras when routine is a surveillance system. Access is a fact. Motive is an argument. In the state's version, the facts built a bridge sturdy enough to carry the weight of the argument. Now jump to the night. 3 close-range shots, 1 per victim. The kind of economy that tells you whoever held the pistol valued control. After gunfire, there's always a second plan. Get rid of the thing that can point back at you. The pistol goes into a paper bag, cheap camouflage, and takes a ride. Not to a pawn shop, not to a river, to a relative's house. That choice matters. Sloppy criminals throw weapons where no one will ever find them. Careful criminals hide them where they can be retrieved later. But care is a spectrum, and this plan had a leak, a witness. Someone sees Frances stash the bag and remembers enough to tell detectives where to look. When officers show up, they don't search the city. They go to an address, to a room, to the spot the witness described. The bag is there. So is the gun. Forensics doesn't need a motive. It prefers measurements. Ballistics people talk in microscopic striations and class characteristics and breech face marks, the unique signatures a firearm leaves on the bullets it launches and the casings it spits. When the lab compares the 3 bullets retrieved from Adrian, Alton, and Farah to test rounds fired from the recovered .125, the answer lines up. Same tool, same barrel, same story. One weapon authored all 3 wounds. The pistol from Jeffrey's drawer, the pistol a witness watched Frances hide, is the pistol that wrote the murders. Defense attorneys know how to fight science. You attack the chain of custody. You question lab protocols. You hint that analysts can be biased toward the state. But chain of custody here wasn't a cracked rope. It was a documented handoff, from recovery to storage to lab to courtroom. Each step logged, each signature a small slice of accountability. And the lab didn't claim magic, it claimed match. In a case made of circumstantial bricks, ballistics was the concrete. Then there's the skirt. Gunshot residue is finicky. It's a mix of particles from primer and propellant. It can land on a shooter's hands, sleeves, and nearby clothing. It can be wiped away, it can be transferred, it can degrade. But when tests indicate residue on a garment worn the night of the murders, the signal cuts through the noise. According to the state, Frances's skirt lit up. The defense tried to downplay it, contamination, proximity, lab artifacts, but combined with everything else, the residue read like echo. Bullets speak once. Residue is the afterword. Now to Frances's explanation. She says she found the gun in her home after the murders and moved it for safety. It's the kind of claim that in a vacuum could be human. Someone panics, someone acts, someone does something unwise but not evil. The problem is that stories that relieve you of guilt have to pull weight against the calendar and the paper trail. If she found a gun she believed belonged to a killer, why didn't she call police immediately? Why not put the weapon on a table in front of detectives and say, "This was in my house"? Why hide it? Hiding suggests ownership, if not of the gun itself, then of the outcome that gun created. And if the murderer was this Charlie, why would he abandon the very tool that could tie him to the crime? Why leave it in the orbit of a woman who could describe him? Why stage an execution with precision and then get careless with the one thing that turns precision into evidence. Investigators built a timeline that prosecutors would later walk the jury through like a guided tour. March. Policies purchased and, by the state's account, Adrian's name forged. Early April. The estranged marriage continues in its fragile orbit. Frances maintains access to Jeffrey's apartment and the drawer with the 125 April 7th. 3 shots, 3 deaths, no forced entry, no disorder. Within hours, the paper bag and the relocation to a relative's home. Less than a day later, insurance claims filed. Days later, weapon recovered, statements taken, ballistics initiated, residue tests queued. Nothing in that order contradicts the state's theory. Much of it props it up. In court, sequence is persuasion. Defense pushed back with Charlie, a dealer, a debt, a hit. They said the gun's presence in Frances's orbit was a setup or a coincidence, that residue can travel, that panic can look like guilt. But the Charlie narrative asked the jury to swallow too many unlikely meals, that a killer executed 3 people, then forgot his gun where the accused could pick it up, that the accused moved that gun without dialing 911, that she then filed insurance claims before grief had a chance to learn its lines, that the boyfriend's gun, loaned from a cousin, stored in a drawer the accused knew well, just happened to be the vehicle for a stranger's crime. Juries don't need certainty, they need coherence. The state's account stacked with fewer wobbles. Consider also the psychology of the weapon choice. A .25 caliber pistol isn't loud power. It's convenience. Small, concealable, easy to carry in a bag and keep hidden in a drawer. It fits the method, 1 round per life, delivered up close, trading horsepower for proximity. A stranger kicking in a door might carry something different, louder, harsher, harder to hide, but easier to dominate with. Here the tool matched intimacy. That inference isn't proof, but it rhymes with everything else. The witness who saw the stashing didn't need to be perfect. Memory rarely is. They needed to be specific enough to send officers to a location and a container that yielded exactly what the state predicted. When a tip produces a gun, and that gun produces a ballistic match, and that match harmonizes with residue on clothing and with access through a boyfriend's drawer, the cumulative weight starts to look like inevitability. Reasonable doubt lives in gaps. This part of the case was mostly seams. The defense tried to shake the ballistics by floating the idea of another similar pistol, same make, same model, introducing the specter of tool mark overlap. But ballistics analysts don't match to brands. They match to barrels. Even guns off the same assembly line develop microscopic quirks from machining and wear. The way 2 records pressed from the same master can crackle differently over time. The lab's conclusion wasn't, "It's likely this kind of gun." It was, "These bullets were fired by this gun." When jurors heard that, they weren't picking between twins. They were picking between a fingerprint and a glove size. If the pistol is the story's spine, the surrounding details are ribs. The way the apartment didn't protest, no signs of a fight. The way the policy clock ticked so close to the gunfire. The way the claims arrived sooner than the condolences. The way Frances's history with forgery made the March signatures feel less like caution and more like rehearsal. None of those alone convicts. Together they hold the case upright. At the end of this chapter, you can strip away every motive speech and still be left with the same metal truth. The murder weapon was in her orbit before the killings, in her hands after, and in the lab with her family's bullets inside its story. You can argue why. You can't argue where. And when jurors can't argue where, they usually stop arguing whether. Which takes us to the room where arguments become verdicts. The state had its map, policies, pistol, residue, witness, timeline. The defense had its ghost, Charlie. In Part 6, we walk into the courtroom seat by seat and watch which story the jury believed when the foreman stood up and spoke for 12. October 1988, a Harris County courtroom becomes the stage where Frances Newton's life will be measured piece by piece. Prosecutors step in with their boxes of files, evidence bags, and the steady confidence of people who believe their case is airtight. Defense attorneys arrive with fewer props, but a singular mission: plant the idea of doubt. Above the jury box hangs the weight of the ultimate penalty, In Texas, capital murder trials don't just decide guilt. They decide life or death. From the first day, the prosecution's strategy is clear. Keep it simple. They frame Frances Newton not as a mystery, but as a pattern, someone who forged, stole, schemed, and finally escalated to murder. They don't need to make her a monster. They just need to show she took the next logical step in her own history. The narrative they build has three pillars: motive, weapon, and behavior. Motive, the life insurance policies. Jurors see the applications, the forged signature, the beneficiary line with Frances's name in ink. Prosecutors hammer the timing, 3 weeks before the murders. Then they remind the jury that Frances filed claims less than a day after her family was killed. This isn't coincidence, they argue. It's premeditation written down on paper. Weapon, the .25 caliber pistol. Ballistics experts testify that the bullets taken from Adrian, Alton, and Farah match the weapon Frances hid in a relative's house. The witness who saw her stash the bag takes the stand, describing her nervous behavior and the exact location police later searched. Then Jeffrey Frio, the boyfriend, admits the gun was his, on loan from his cousin, and that Frances knew where it was. That connection pulls her directly into the chain of custody. Behavior, what Frances did before and after the murders. Prosecutors call insurance agents who confirm how quickly she filed claims. They call forensic specialists who describe gunpowder residue on her skirt. They remind the jury that there were no signs of forced entry, no robbery, no struggle, just precision. They present her history, the forgery conviction, the theft from an employer. Each fact is a small nail. Together they build a coffin. The defense doesn't argue the evidence is fabricated. Instead, they argue the evidence is misunderstood. They anchor everything to the mysterious man they call Charlie. According to Frances, Adrian owed money to a drug dealer. This Charlie had motive to collect by force. The murders, she insists, were his work, not hers. The defense tries to explain away the gun by suggesting it could have been planted or mishandled. The residue, they argue, might be contamination. The insurance policies, they say, were meant as financial security, not a death warrant. But when it comes time for Adrian's family to speak, the defense theory crumbles under emotion. Reporters ask his parents about Charlie. Adrian's mother answers with a line that would echo through the years. "There ain't no Charlie. She's Charlie." Her words strike harder than lab results because they come from the people who knew Adrian best. They believed in his innocence, and they believed Frances had turned on her own family. The trial itself moves faster than the years of appeals that would follow. Jurors listen to days of testimony, study exhibits, and weigh the competing stories. On one side, a calculated plan for money. On the other, a shadowy figure no one can find. The scales never really balance. When the jury files back into the room, the air stiffens. Reporters lean forward. Family members hold hands. The foreman stands, holding the slip of paper that carries the answer. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of capital murder." No hesitation. No ambiguity. Just a verdict that locks Frances Newton's fate. The punishment phase follows. Texas law requires jurors to decide if a defendant is dangerous enough to remain a threat, if there are mitigating circumstances worth sparing a life. The prosecutors argue her pattern of deception, her willingness to kill her children for money, and her lack of remorse prove she is dangerous and undeserving of mercy. The defense begs for life imprisonment, insisting she isn't a continuing threat, insisting she could be rehabilitated. But mercy doesn't win. On October 25, 1988, Frances Newton is sentenced to die by lethal injection. She becomes one of the very few women on Texas death row, a place where time moves both quickly and unbearably slow. The gavel falls, the jurors leave, and Frances is led away, already beginning the long march of appeals. The trial doesn't answer every question. It doesn't erase the defense's narrative completely, but it cements the state's version as the official record, that Frances Newton killed her husband and 2 children for money, using her boyfriend's gun, and then tried to profit from their deaths. For the jury, the case was straightforward. For Frances, it was only the beginning of a 17-year fight against the verdict. Because while the courtroom declared her guilty, She refused to ever say the words herself. And on death row, silence can last a lifetime. But lifetimes on death row are rarely smooth. Appeals pile up, legal teams come and go. Governors intervene, sometimes at the last second. For Francis Newton, those years would stretch on like a rope pulled taut, nearly breaking but never snapping until 2005. When the jury delivered its verdict in 1988, Francis Newton's life should have ended within a few short years. In Texas, death row cases move fast, and executions are often scheduled within 5 or 6 years of conviction. But Francis would remain behind those gray bars for almost 18 years. 17 years of appeals, reprieves, motions, and last-minute pleas. 17 years of clinging to one story. Charlie did it, not me. Her appeals began like most capital cases, with direct challenges to the trial. The defense argued that prosecutors had relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence, that forensic testing was flawed, and that her forgery and theft history had been unfairly used to poison the jury. Every claim was shot down. Courts affirmed the verdict again and again. But defense lawyers knew time was their greatest weapon. If they could keep the case alive, maybe new evidence or shifting politics could tip the scales. Year after year, Francis's attorneys filed motions. Some targeted the ballistics evidence, suggesting that the pistol found in the relative's house may not have been the only possible murder weapon. Others attacked the gunshot residue test, claiming contamination or poor lab standards. Still others argued that her behavior, filing insurance claims so quickly, was circumstantial, not conclusive. But none of these arguments shook the foundation of the conviction. Each court reviewing the case sided with the prosecution. The evidence was overwhelming, the verdict solid. Still, Francis gained attention outside the courts. Activists against the death penalty rallied to her cause. True crime writers and documentarians saw in her story the possibility of a wrongful conviction. Was Charlie real? Could the gun have been planted? Had prosecutors oversimplified a messy case? The questions didn't change the record, but they kept her name alive in public debate. Then came December 1, 2004. Francis was strapped in hours from execution. Reporters were already gathering in Huntsville, ready to cover the first execution of a black woman in Texas in 70 years. But with just 2 hours to spare, Governor Rick Perry granted a 120-day reprieve. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles had recommended the delay to allow for further forensic testing. It was a rare move. Suddenly, Francis had hope. Supporters thought the new testing might reveal that the bullets didn't come from Jeffrey's pistol, or that another weapon had been involved. They believed the science might vindicate her after nearly 2 decades of insisting on her innocence. For 4 months, the case was suspended in a kind of limbo, the outcome hanging on lab results. In February 2005, those results came back, crushing. The new ballistics analysis confirmed the original conclusion. The 3 bullets that killed Adrian, Alton and Farah had come from the pistol Francis hid. There was no second weapon, no mystery gunman. The reprieve had given her more time, but instead of opening the door to doubt, it slammed it shut even tighter. Even so, her attorneys kept filing. In August 2005, they asked the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals for a stay of execution, arguing that she had been wrongly linked to the weapon and that her trial counsel had been ineffective. The court refused. They filed again for a writ of habeas corpus, claiming constitutional violations. Denied. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court twice. Both times, the court declined to hear the case. By September 2005, the legal avenues were nearly exhausted. Her new lawyer, David Dow, made one last attempt, asking Governor Perry for another 30-day reprieve. He argued that if given time, he could prove Francis hadn't fired the murder weapon. But Perry had already granted her more time once before, and the new testing had only reinforced her guilt. He refused. In a surprising twist, Adrian's parents, who had lost their son and 2 grandchildren, asked for clemency, not because they believed Francis was innocent, but because they opposed the death penalty itself. They wanted her to serve life in prison, not die at the state's hand. Their plea carried moral weight. but it fell on deaf ears. The Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 7-0 against commutation. Frances had outlasted nearly every possibility. 17 years of paperwork, 17 years of lawyers coming and going, 17 years of sitting in a cell while her case climbed the ladder of courts and was shoved back down. Each step promised hope. Each step ended with the same answer: guilty. By September 13, 2005, there were no moves left. Appeals denied. Clemency refused. Execution date set. Frances Newton had spent almost half her life on death row, repeating the same story. Charlie killed my family, not me. But now the clock had run out. The next morning, guards would walk her down a final hallway to the chamber in Huntsville. She would be offered a last meal. She would be asked if she had final words. The state would do what the jury ordered 17 years earlier. And in that moment, Frances Newton's story would no longer belong to lawyers or judges. It would belong to history. September 14, 2005, the last day of Frances Newton's life, begins not with drama, but with routine. At the Women's Death Row Unit in Gatesville, guards come early. They follow the same procedure they've rehearsed countless times, but for Frances it is the first and the last. She is moved from her cell, shackled at the wrists and ankles, and placed in a van headed to Huntsville. The journey is about 150 miles, long enough for reflection, too short for escape. Every turn of the wheels brings her closer to the Walls Unit, the red brick prison that has witnessed more executions than any other place in America. She has been here before. In December 2004, when Governor Perry granted her that 120-day reprieve, she came within hours of dying. Reporters remember how the clock nearly ran out. That night she returned to her cell, still breathing, still with hope. But this time there are no reprieves, no more motions pending, no stays coming down from the Supreme Court. This time the schedule is final. In Huntsville, she is placed in a holding cell just steps away from the execution chamber. The hours drag, punctuated by visits. Her spiritual advisor comes. A handful of supporters outside gather with signs calling for mercy. Her attorney, David Dow, makes his last appeals to the press, insisting that doubt still remains. But inside the prison, the machinery of death doesn't stop for doubt. The state has a timetable, and it will be kept. By afternoon, family members of the victims arrive to witness. Adrian Newton's parents are there. They have lived with this case for nearly 2 decades. They never doubted Frances's guilt, but they opposed the death penalty. They asked for her life to be spared, not for her sake, but because they believed killing her would not heal their loss. Yet here they are, forced to watch the state do what they could not prevent. Frances is offered a last meal. Many inmates request fried chicken, hamburgers, ice cream. She declines, no food. Maybe a gesture of control, maybe resignation, maybe nothing at all. When asked if she wants to make a final statement, she shakes her head. No. One word, then silence. For nearly 18 years she has insisted she is innocent. In this moment she offers nothing. No confession, no plea, no apology. Silence as her final defense. At 6:01 p.m., the process begins. Witnesses take their places behind glass. Frances is strapped to the gurney, leather restraints holding her arms and legs. IV lines run from her arms to a room hidden from view, where unseen technicians prepare the syringes. The warden asks if she has any last words. Again, she declines. Then the signal is given. The first drug enters her bloodstream, rendering her unconscious. The second paralyzes her muscles. The third stops her heart. It takes less than 10 minutes. At 6:17 p.m., Frances Newton is pronounced dead. Outside, reporters rush to file their stories. The headlines emphasize her place in history, the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War era. For some, she is a cold-blooded killer who turned her family into cash. For others, she is a woman who may have been wrongly convicted, executed despite lingering doubts. For everyone, she is now a closed case. But death doesn't end debate. Within hours, questions surface again. Was there really no Charlie? Did the courts dismiss too quickly the possibility of another gun? Could her quick insurance claims have been desperation rather than calculation? Supporters point to her silence as evidence of defiance, someone unwilling to confess to a crime she didn't commit. Critics see it as proof of remorselessness. In that chamber, Frances Newton gave no answers. She left behind only silence, and silence can be interpreted 100 different ways. But the law doesn't interpret silence. The law closes the book. And for Texas, the book closed at 6:17 p.m. Yet stories like this never truly end at the gurney. They ripple outward into documentaries, debates, and conversations about justice and mercy. They force us to ask whether the state's certainty matches the messy truth of human lives. And they leave us with a final question. What does justice look like when silence is the last word? Frances Newton's execution was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her afterlife in public memory. Within days, television crews were packaging her case into primetime specials. Newspapers ran headlines about the Black Widow of Texas. Documentaries followed. True crime series like Fatal Attraction and Deadly Women featured her story, highlighting the chilling details of a mother who turned her family into a payout. In 2006, she became the subject of Women on Death Row, a program that asked not only about her guilt, but about the larger machinery of capital punishment. The media fascination came from contradictions. Frances looked ordinary. She was not the stereotypical portrait of a killer. She was a mother, young, religious at times, even soft-spoken. That normalcy, combined with the brutality of her crime, created a narrative people couldn't stop picking apart. How could someone cradle children one year and execute them the next? Was she truly a calculating killer, or was she the wrong person pinned beneath a mountain of circumstantial evidence? Supporters clung to the story of Charlie. They argued that the state never seriously investigated whether Adrian had drug connections, whether a debt could have brought violence into the Newton home. They pointed to her silence at execution as proof she never gave up her claim of innocence. They raised questions about the gunshot residue tests, about the chain of custody, about whether prosecutors had built their case around insurance policies instead of hard proof. To them, Frances was one more example of Texas moving too quickly toward the needle. Critics, though, pointed to the mountain of evidence. The insurance policies forged just weeks before the murders, the speed with which she filed claims, the pistol, traced back to her boyfriend, hidden by Frances herself, the ballistics match, the residue on her skirt. They argued that no mythical Charlie could explain away all of those threads. For them, her silence at the end wasn't innocence. It was refusal to accept guilt, a final act of defiance that denied the victim's closure. Even Adrian's parents embodied the contradictions. They believed Frances had killed their son and grandchildren. They never doubted her guilt. Yet they begged the state not to execute her. For them, the death penalty was one more act of violence, a cycle that couldn't undo what had been done. Their voices added moral weight to the debate. If even the victim's family wanted her life spared, was execution truly justice? Today, Frances Newton's name still stirs divided reactions. In classrooms, her case is studied as an example of circumstantial evidence leading to capital punishment. In true crime forums, debates rage about whether Charlie was real or invented. In anti-death penalty circles, her execution is cited as part of the broader conversation about whether the state can ever be trusted with the power to kill. But beyond the arguments lies the chilling reality that cannot be undone. On April 7, 1987, 3 people lost their lives. Adrian, just 23, Alton, only 7. Farah, not even 2 years old. Their deaths are the immovable center of the case, the fact that no debate can soften. Whether Frances Newton was a cold-blooded murderer or a wrongly convicted woman, the Newton family was destroyed in a single night, and no legal appeal or political argument could bring them back. What lingers is the question of justice. Was it served when the jury found her guilty, when the appeals courts upheld the verdict, when Texas carried out the sentence? Or does justice demand certainty that no one can truly guarantee in a system built by humans, interpreted by humans, and flawed like humans? Frances Newton's execution left behind silence, but silence isn't the same as closure. Her story endures because it forces us to look at the sharp edge of human nature, greed, betrayal, desperation, and at the sharper edge of the law that answers those things with finality. Was she a mother who murdered for money? Or was she a woman swallowed by a narrative too neat to resist? 17 years, 10 months, and a gurney in Huntsville ended the state of Texas versus Francis Newton. But the questions remain open, waiting for each person who hears the story to decide. Was this justice, or was this one more tragedy stacked on top of 3 lives already lost?